Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a YouTube podcast from Key TV in Eureka, California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. I started this show as a means to pursue my suddenly exploding interest in all things UAP. My initial concerns evolved from a basic curiosity about what was being seen and reported by credible observers to a life-changing exploration of life, philosophy, technology, esoterica, sustainability, spirituality, and more. I've had many conversations with a broad range of brilliant people, all of whom are exploring these ideas and determining for themselves what this all means and how it may ultimately impact the way we live and view our lives. One aspect of this conversation seems to appear again and again in various guises and through seemingly unrelated mechanisms: the intersection of the phenomenon with philosophy and the broader search by all of us for existential meaning. Our guest today is Dr. Michael E. Zimmerman, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He was recommended to me as a potential guest by author and Professor James Madden, who we've had on the show and will again soon. And I'm glad for that recommendation. Zimmerman has been covering the phenomenon since long before it was cool. He was writing about alien abductions and contact in the 1990s, and even then engaged the subject with the rigor and scope it deserved, even as doing so could end one up under academic review, as with Harvard professor John Mack. He's published numerous articles on the subject in academic, peer-reviewed publications and has long demonstrated courage in the face of institutional myopia and groupthink. He's a member of the Society for UAP Studies, which is dedicated to using a multidisciplinary approach to study anomalous phenomenon, and there's some brilliant work on their website, which I'll link to in the description. I'm thrilled to have him on the show to help us grapple with some of the phenomenon's philosophical implications and to explore how technology should figure into these conversations, as well as how known thinkers like Martin Heidegger and others have already tread some of this ground. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Glad to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me.
So I was perusing the articles that were sent to me, and I was obviously favorably impressed by the depth of your work and the insights that you provided. And in particular, I like where you're at in the conversation. I've been reading a lot of Jeffrey Kripal, which a lot of people in this field do. And he's been talking a lot about how the humanities, while on the surface it may seem like they're excluded from this conversation in a lot of ways, they're actually pivotal to the conversation, and it may sort of re-enliven what has been the deteriorating role that the humanities have played in all of our lives. So that's kind of where part of the place I want to lead the conversation. But let's start with how you initially got intrigued by things in the sky and in the water and in space and, the whole UAP thing, and how that ultimately became part of what you chose to study as your academic career.
Well, that's a good introduction. And there's a lot of things that go into stimulating a person's interest in one thing or another.
Absolutely.
But I always had something like a philosophical bent. In a high school, there's no such thing as philosophy. They don't teach that. So encountering it in college was really mind-blowing. And I think it's one reason I decided to, try to become a philosophy professor was how thrilling it was for me to be in a philosophy class and learning that the way I normally make sense of things is not true and forever, but it is evolved historically and other people think differently.
Yeah.
And how do we arrive at some agreed upon conclusion about what's real and how we know what we're saying is true and so on. So my own personal origins have to do with the conversation I had with my dad, my origins of interest in the UFO thing. I think it was 57. I was 11. And it was my first adult conversation with my father. I remember he was in the living room and I came in to ask him a question because I had just read in the paper what I think was a 5-year mark of the big 1952 UFO flap across the country, but in particularly over Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Now, my father was had studied at MIT. He had his master's and was on his way to his PhD when the war broke out in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. So he left the PhD program to go work for industry for the war effort. He had a heart murmur, so he couldn't be in the service. So he was a technical man. His PhD was going to be in chemical engineering. That was his specialty. So I said, Dad, what do you make of this 1952 flap, as UFO events were called back then? Because I said the general who was heading the biggest press conference at the end of World War II was telling the press 5 years earlier that, well, really the lights we were seeing and all that resulted from some kind of atmospheric inversion, which meant lights on the ground were somehow projected into the sky.
Some things never change, right?
He said, no, that's not an explanation of this. Something really happened there, and this is an effort to distract attention and pretend it didn't occur. So that right away gave me the sense that, well, this is something that I can pay attention to. Because my dad, who's super smart and who had training in areas which would give, he wasn't a philosophy major where our knowledge of technology is limited. He had knowledge of industrial technology then and chemical processes.
Yeah.
So that helped pave the way for my subsequent interest.
Would you call that a permission kind of? I mean, like he gave you permission intellectually to engage with it?
Yeah, he didn't shy away from it. And moreover, there occurred in our own little town where we grew up. He ended up in the plastics industry, and for 7 years we lived in a little town, Newcomerstown, Ohio, where he founded a plastics plant. He was the general manager of this plant. And one day, I unfortunately wasn't there for this event, but I got heard about it from the family. I was out as a teenager doing something. But one evening, two young friends of the family who were in their early 20s were walking in our neighborhood, taking in this summer air. And they, all of a sudden, my parents heard this banging and screaming on the front door. So they let them in, and they were white and shaking and petrified. This, according to both my parents and a couple of other siblings. There were eight siblings in all. And they had encountered a UFO, a cigar-shaped UFO that was following them up the street. And it was absolutely terrifying to them. So I don't know a lot of further details because this was long ago and I wasn't a witness.
Yeah.
But this I think helped cement in my father's mind as well as my own the fact that there's something appearing in the skies to people that is far beyond anything we have the technical power to mimic, and that it's meaningful. It means something, that there is this presence in our skies, something that is beyond our ken, both in terms of its intention and in terms of how the heck they do this.
Yeah. Two interesting things about that point. I mean, first off, those two things that you just mentioned, that there's something in our skies that we can't mimic or can't, replicate ourselves, and that it's unexplained and meaningful is kind of where the conversation needs to be, globally in our country. And that's kind of what people are hoping that the congressional hearings and the whistleblower David Grush and other folks might eventually get us there. And that aspect of permission. I mean, it seems like a lot of us who are already interested in the topic are sitting around waiting for the government to give people permission to take this seriously because they don't have the native knowledge to know whether or not it's, actually something extraordinary or if it's just something like a black project that we previously don't know about. And what I appreciate about academics like yourself and others in the actual UFO field and whatnot is that in lieu of the government, you guys are sort of acting as the intellectual authority to give permission for folks, I think, to begin to engage with this topic. Like for myself, Diana Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, was the first book where I read and I saw sort of the brilliant names that were associated with some of the things that were happening. And it kind of gave me permission to engage. And I think that's huge. My next question for you so you had these experiences. Now, did that basically run continuously through your life, or did you walk away from it as you sort of got into your 20s? And then was there an event that later brought it back to you as something, vital?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Yes, I had interest, like many people, in the UFO. I mean, I kind of like UFO instead of UAP.
Sure. No, me too.
And throughout my growing up, I mean, there was, I remember in the 60s, mid 60s, the whole growing up of Hynek when he tried to explain away a swamp gas, these sightings in Michigan, and that really made him become a different type of ufologist. And he and Jacques Vallee teamed up and did all kind of important things. So
Yeah.
I was attuned to it. But, even more important to me throughout this time was the threat of nuclear war.
Absolutely.
I can't emphasize how much this shadowed my whole growing up, as it did many people. But I mean, it was overly intense for me. I mean, I really, I remember asking my dad one day if he was going to prepare a fallout shelter for us. And, he gave me a look like, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
But I think there's probably some relationship between the showing up of the UFOs in the numbers that did show up in the mid 40s and beyond, and also their significant intervention at various ICBM missile silos, both in the US and in the Soviet Union during this time, showing their ability to shut down nuclear launch processes, and also to initiate
Yeah.
a nuclear launch and then stop it.
Yeah.
It's this great book, The UFOs and Nukes. Highly recommend. It goes into great detail about all this.
That's Robert Hastings, right?
Yeah, Robert Hastings, a
Yeah.
great contribution to the literature.
Yeah.
And so this was of grave concern for me. And then in the 1980s, I got, now I was a professor. I want to add one thing, by the way.
Sure. Yeah.
One of the great things about being a tenured professor is that you're allowed to say and do things that otherwise you wouldn't want to do
Absolutely.
because of your reputation and so on. Now, I wasn't going to be getting into all this stuff too much if I were untenured, right? But as a tenured professor, I realized that you have to step out. If the tenure is worth anything, it should be to give you permission to speak the truth as you understand it.
Absolutely. Take risks too. Yeah.
Right. And that otherwise, what's the point of having tenure?
Yeah.
It's not just to guarantee you have a job till you're dead or whatever. It should be allow you courageously at times to say things that maybe people don't want to hear.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
one of the things I did in the I recall very well, 1982, I was spending a sabbatical in Berkeley. At the time, I was at Tulane in New Orleans. And Stanford University had that March of 82 had a major conference on the whole UFO the whole arms race, which was so terrifying to people around the world. And that led me to found at Tulane a organization called United Campuses Against Nuclear War. It was a network, and so I really got into it. And I gave lots of workshops and presentations, and I wrote 3 academic articles about the arms race and so on. And it was at this time that I started to discover that this is the late 80s, early 90s, that John Mack from Harvard was also involved in the nuclear arms race campaign, the campaign against nuclear proliferation. And so in 1991, I guess it was, I discovered that he was interested in the alien abduction phenomenon.
Mhm.
Now, this was really a moment for me. It was created in me a kind of sinking feeling that I could no longer hold the UFO phenomenon as some interesting sci-fi possibility,
Mhm.
but that there's something to it. Because a man of his intellectual and national status, he was you might call a national intellectual,
Yeah.
that level. That meant
Pulitzer
I
Prize winner. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia, like known for lots of things. Yes.
Pulitzer Prize winner and
Yeah.
you're a psychiatrist at Harvard. And he
Mhm.
had been writing a lot about the effect that the nuclear arms race was having on teenage psychology. So
I didn't realize that. That's
anyway,
interesting.
yeah, became a major player in this whole domain.
Yeah.
So I wrote to him, and he and I had shared other interests as well, but we can talk about that as I later discovered. But and then I went up to meet him at Harvard. I had a philosophy meeting up there in October of 1992, and we had a really good conversation. And after that, he and I continued to converse, and I would make periodic visits up there, many visits up to Harvard at his uh, actually, he founded an organization called about psychology and social change, Institute for Psychology and Social Change, which is where he housed his own program, which had to do with alien abduction. And I'm still involved with that. Karen Austin is the head of the director of the John E. Mack Institute. And she will soon be coming out live with a major new website in order to enhance and continue and to help fund the investigation into the whole alien abduction phenomenon. But for me, the melding of John Mack and my interest in the nuclear arms race and our simultaneous interest in the alien abduction phenomenon was meaningful. Because for years in the 1980s, I was reading everything I could get my hands on about alien abduction.
Yeah.
Starting with historian Jacobs at Temple University, Bud Hopkins.
Yeah.
And then of course, John Mack published his book in the early 1990s about abduction. So the connection between the arms race, the UFOs, and alien abduction then became pretty significant for me.
It's interesting to hear you say that about the nuke phenomenon, because there's something I wanted to talk to you about a little bit later about AI. And in one of your papers, you talk about how AI might be the new existential nuke kind of thing.
Yes.
So I want to ask you that. But first, one of the things that people often argue about is whether or not, alien abduction, or especially a lot of the metaphysical contact that people seem to be having, whether or not that's taking place with real objective beings other than humanity, or whether or not it's like some internal psychological phenomenon or a collective humanity kind of, zeitgeist that we're wrestling with, or whatever. There was a lot of fear back in the day, as you mentioned. I mean, I was born in 1976, and I remember a lot of that. The Day After Tomorrow came out, and I was like, "Oh my Lord, we're all gonna die." And no matter what we think, that threat still exists today, which is something.
Yes.
But my question to you is, as a philosophy professor, I mean, do you think that the fact that it was such an existential threat and source of angst for humanity, does that argue for its objectivity, or does that, in your mind, make it more like it's a subjective aspect of our own psychology?
You mean
what
the
I'm saying?
UFO phenomenon?
Well, the UFO phenomenon and the contact phenomenon, and how they tend to warn about, nuclear
right.
war and that sort of thing. Does that mean to you it's more likely to be objective, or just within us?
Well, that's a great question, and the question is still out there, isn't it?
Sure.
Right. But in the 50s, as you know, because you've become a student of this, we had all these contactees who reported these space brothers would come down and meet them and remonstrate with them about helping to end the arms race, and the nuclear war was terrible. Of course, it's all right. Everything they're saying is true. That
Valiant Thor and those guys, right?
Yeah. And that's one of the things that John Mack says. So many of his people he had as his patients, his clients, who shared with them their abduction experience. A lot of the abduction experience had to do with warnings toward the end about the nuclear war potential and the arms race, and to encourage them to take care of the environment and so on. So it followed right through, and even today, it remains a major theme in all this.
Yeah.
So how do we parse this relationship between nuts and bolts, real and psychological? Well, one of the things that struck me when I read many years ago Carl Jung's book about the UFOs was that he says that UFOs are real in the sense that they are clocked at radar on radar going 6,000 miles an hour.
Yes, they're physical objects. Yes.
So there's a reality side to them. Now, he said there's also at the same time a psychological, spiritual dimension, because insofar as they're circular, saucer-like, and we know that there are many other shapes, but he depicted this circle as a kind of mandala. It's a symbol of wholeness and unity and integration. And it's as if the saucer was a reminder, the birth of a new legend, a new myth, even a new religion. And this is part of Diana Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, that is calling humanity to transcend its obsession with control and domination, to the extent that we even using ready-to-use nuclear weapons that would kill all of us to achieve our aim of domination. The whole thing is
Yeah, who are you dominating in the end, right? If they're all dead.
yeah, it's not a path to success, really.
Yeah.
So how do we? So that's the thing that she brought up in her American Cosmic to good effect. The book's been well received for good reason. And she's showing that, yes, on one hand, there's an objective aspect to this, no doubt about it. But what is the objective aspect? Assuming that these creatures are from outer space is a complete, who knows? We don't know what they are, where they're from.
Yeah.
And this is where she calls on Jacques Vallee, who wrote the most important book in UFO history, Passport to Magonia. Is tied into all this. She met him and she introduces his work deeply into her own hypothesis. That is to say that the most important aspect possibly of the UFO is its spiritual component.
Yeah.
This is a challenge to modern humanity's story of who we are and what it's all about. Is what it's all about the technological domination of nature? I mean, look at our society. It all depends upon our being able to use all the oil, coal, and atomic energy available to us to create creature products for ourselves, so to make ourselves immortal if possible. Is that really what the human destiny is about? Is that who we really are? Or because when these critters show up, these UFOs doing these, and they're clearly there's a technological aspect to the whole thing. It's clear that they completely outgun us. That we would be putty in their hands if they meant to attack us. But it's also a challenge to our own kind of hubris that we're the masters of the universe. No, that's not the case. So she tries in her book to emphasize that we don't really know where these beings are from. And Jacques Vallee would say the extraterrestrial hypothesis may be the least plausible given the problems. But then who are they? How do they relate to us? It seems like our whole history is characterized by godlike beings coming from the skies and bringing religion with them.
Yeah.
And so that I think is the real import of her book, is reminding us of the spiritual, religious, psychological side of UFOs. Not that they're just invented by us, but that there are dimensions to the whole phenomenon which we ignore if we focus solely on the nuts and bolts reality of the things. That is important, clearly, but it's not really getting us to why, where from, and where is it headed.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you were talking, it's like I've heard this element in several conversations I've had where it's almost as if there's two roads before us. One is technological and one is spiritual. And in some ways, the UFO demonstrates that maybe both are possible. And that I know that you're a scholar of Heidegger, Martin Heidegger. Could you talk a little bit about what his views are in terms of technology and humans' relationships with it, and what we can learn from him and our own consideration of how we should be balancing these two, if there is a balance to be struck?
Yeah, I want to put a pitch in before I go. Another philosopher whom I met online recently, I read his great book, Unidentified Flying Hyperobject.
I've had him on the show.
Yeah, named
James Madden.
James Madden.
Yes.
He takes off from Diana Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, and fills out the Heidegger dimension to it. Because she both begins and ends the book with reference to Heidegger, but she doesn't say much about it. But he does, and to really good effect. I mean, I learned a lot from his connecting all these things together. He's clearly a master teacher.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend his book.
And he's also a really nice guy, which helps.
We had a Zoom a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I saw your interview with him on your program, which is also
one of my favorites, actually. Yeah.
Well, when I went up to Harvard, meeting with John Mack and the Program for Extraordinary Experience Research, this is what he called PEER, P-E-R. This was the name for the program that was funded by Lawrence Rockefeller, and was allowing him to have off-campus offices with staff and all this kind of stuff. So my pitch going up there was that these UFOs are a challenge to our hubristic self-understanding. And what is that about? Heidegger gives us fantastic reading of the history of Western civilization. I wrote a couple of books about this and a whole bunch of articles. But basically, he's saying this: look, technology is not just machinery and the powers they give it. The technology is, you have to take a step back. It's the way of disclosing things which allows machinery to be brought forth by human activity.
Yeah.
So what's the way of disclosing things that's characteristic of modernity, of modern life? Because remember, up until 1700s, there are a lot of parallels between the technical capacities of Europe and other countries. China, for example, for many centuries was way ahead of us technologically. We learned a lot from them. But something happened to them in the 1600s. They turned inward, concerns about their own constant invasion from the Mongols in the north and so on. They had to turn their attention elsewhere. But the West, with the discovery of the New World in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, this set off in connection with the development of modern science in European Renaissance, starting with Galileo, probably the world's most important scientist ever, connecting mathematics to how physical objects work.
Yeah.
This led to an extraordinary development of scientific technological innovation on the part of humanity. But so all this is already known, but Heidegger's twist is this: the way in which we disclose things in advance, starting in the 1800s, is that for something to be basically means for it to be an object of study for human beings. And if we can't get a clear and distinct idea of it, that is through mathematical physics, this is coming really out of Descartes, it's as good as not existing.
Yeah.
For something to be means to be explicable, understandable in terms of our modern science. Now, what goes out the window is God, angels, Bigfoot, all kind of creatures that populated the historic world, a pre-modern world, for all time.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly these were gone. And we're left with a stripped down model of the universe, which is a universe which has no purpose, no destiny. It's just
Right.
accidental events, following causal processes, leading to our emerging on the earth as clever apes at some point in history.
Random
And
accidents.
die out. Yeah, and it's all over with. Now,
Yeah.
Heidegger challenged that. He says, look, human beings have been given somehow are endowed with this capacity to reveal things, given our language. So we have this gift of language, which lets us name things and disclose how they work and what they are and how we're to operate with them and be with them. And this is true for humans everywhere. But what happened again with the origins of modern science and Galileo, Descartes, Newton, and so on was a increasingly constricted disclosure of things, so that anything that didn't fit into the scientific model of what a thing can be, amenable to prediction and control, according to with the queen of science as being mathematical physics.
Mm-hmm.
Those things really didn't exist anymore. Now, where this ends up in the 19th and 20th century, Heidegger makes a big deal of this, is that the human being too becomes raw material for the techno-industrial project. We're no different than timber or uranium or whatever it
Absolutely.
is needed, or oil. We're just a cog in the wheel.
And that is fundamental to the illnesses that plague our society right now. We are the product, as they say on social media, right? Like,
That's right.
yeah.
So that this is a tremendously unhappy outcome of the Promethean project. And this is something also in Pasulka's book. Jim Madden makes much of this as well.
Mhm.
That Prometheus was a god who gave us fire,
Yeah.
stole it from the Titan, gave it to us, and that the problem with fire, representing technology, because with fire you get metallurgy, and with iron you conquer the world, right?
Yeah.
And so the problem with it is it has a trajectory, and the trajectory is ultimately human servitude to the machinery we create, or we're impelled to create because of the way in which we're disclosing things. It's nothing but stuff enhancing our power.
Yeah.
And that power escapes us, where it's no longer our power, it's the power of the system in a
Yeah.
way. Yeah. So anyway, now let me just say this. This is what I took off of me to talk about at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
I would describe this worldview
Mm-hmm.
to people and show how the UFO fit into this. And the UFO was a reminder that this project is not only they're whatever these UFO beings are, they're clearly way beyond us. And the nuclear arms race is an indication that allowing ourselves to be put in the grip of this way of disclosing or making sense of things is leading to our own annihilation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's powerful. I mean, is the solution according to Heidegger? I mean, when I was in high school, I tried to read On Being and Time, and I didn't get very far. I need to try again. But my question to you is there a solution to that, the arc of the project? I mean, ultimately, in his viewing, where if we, open up what we are willing to disclose or engage with, if it's outside of that scientific process, does that begin to open up our possibilities as well? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Heidegger was a really interesting character. In 1966, the USSR photographed with a satellite the dark side of the moon,
Mm-hmm.
the side we never see. And it's a strange looking photo. The photo is really strange because the back side of the moon is totally unlike the front side. It does lead to all kinds of questions about what
Yeah.
is the moon, but I'm not going down that rabbit trail at the moment. But he said it terrified him, horrified him. And I think that's because Heidegger did not like the modern scientific representation of the world. I think what he preferred the way of representing or making sense of the world that was more common to the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that everything was finite and had a place, and there was a hierarchy, a structure that included other, the whole Platonic hierarchy of beings where even the planets were divinities in some way. Now, Heidegger didn't necessarily buy into that, but the modern scientific worldview for him was very unsatisfying, as it is for many people.
Mm-hmm.
But here's something that I want to
Increasingly so, too.
put
I
out
mean,
there, right, for your listeners, and that
please.
is environmental amnesia. If you're born in 1990, for example, and so you're becoming of age in the 2000s, or imagine you were born 15 years ago, your understanding of the pre-digital world, I'm talking about analog reality, is completely unavailable to you.
Yeah.
Everyone's got the cell phone in the face, right? My wife and I watched a month or two ago, Love Story, which is based on a novel by Yale literature person. It's a good movie, but what was striking about it was all analog. I don't even think there was a car radio going. There was machinery, cars and stuff, but it was all about human relationships. So I'm thinking about back to my first encounter with the digital in a way that bothered me was about 1976. When I was teaching at Tulane, seeing a student walking through Audubon Park right across from Tulane, wearing headphones with the Sony Walkman.
Yeah.
And I say, wow, look at this guy he's canceling out the ambient world of sight, of sound, and so on. That's part of the park experience.
Yeah.
And he's now totally becoming a solo subject.
You're exactly right.
Involved,
Isolated from everything else except
isolated
his
from everything.
mind. Yeah.
And now, looking back at that, watching that film triggered this memory for me. And I said, wow, that was where, for me, recognition of where this is going started for me. Now, let me add one other thing about this. The next step is AI. Now, when these
Yes.
chapters came out last year, it shocked a lot of people because the companies behind all this, OpenAI and so on, even though Elon Musk helped found that, and part of it was to help warn people about the dangers of AI getting too powerful. The populace wasn't really ready for this. Goldman Sachs last year estimated that 300 million white-collar jobs will eventually be lost as AI really gets going.
Yeah.
The other aspect of it that's so disturbing, and when I read Ray Kurzweil's terrific book from the late 90s called no,
Singularity, or
2000s, called The Singularity is Near.
yeah.
Singularity meaning that moment when AGI takes over, where computers leave us behind. It's the concept of exponential growth. Most of what growth we experience is linear. Things just slowly get more and more better, but when you're dealing with exponential growth, it has a upward curve.
Yeah.
And the curve of current artificial intelligence research is nearly vertical. The smartest people on the planet, the biggest money on the planet, is all about AI. And this is going to be a total game changer. We could talk about that. Maybe we'll talk about that in another program. You have to invite me
Well,
back.
I will, but they're related in a lot of ways, and they're also related with spirituality. Part of what I've been struggling with the AI conversation is that as I've been getting more and more in tune with, these subjects, which open me up to all kinds of spiritual ideas that I'd neglected before, it occurs to me that with the advent of AI and things like virtual reality and those sorts of things, that instead of living in this reality and confronting what actually may be parts of this reality with a godlike mind or any of those things, what if humanity cuts itself off from those experiences by creating its own artificial version of those, and by doing so never gets to the point where it actually realizes who it really is? So it goes off in a meta existential direction that is ultimately going to end us up unhappy and as disenfranchised as we are now, the product. But there is an option. We just don't realize it because we fabricated an escape hatch that is actually more like a prison cell.
Well, this part of the paradox of Prometheus, this is a famous Greek myth, that
Yeah.
I think Prometheus was a Titan. I don't think he was a god. I have to think back about that. In any case, the idea that this is part of Pasulka's point. A lot of UFO people interested, UFO researchers, I think they look at the UFOs kind of like as the latest gods coming down to Earth. I think of ancient aliens. Think of the effect of 15 years of ancient aliens, right? On now, on the one hand, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, it opens up the
It makes
conversation.
us rethink human origins. And it may be that the story our anthropologists tell us is just not up to the task. But part of the religious spiritual dimension of the UFO is not only the warning about atomic weapons and nuclear war and so on, but also the hope, the yearning. You see that they're going to bring us that zero gravity, which is going to let us, go to the stars, or the discoveries will end our energy shortage, or that will basically allow us to become masters of the universe. You get right down to it.
Yeah.
That's how it's being greeted by many of the people on the UFO nuts and bolts side, and that's why they're so suspicious of the military and the contractors is hiding all this information from us. And
which is also, makes it seem like the government thinks the same thing. Like the government's like, how are we going to get this information from the aliens or whatever in order to have a military advantage?
That's right.
Yeah.
Assuming that this is this is so complex. You've been studying this for years now. You know how complicated and strange the whole thing is. I suspect in many ways the government is puzzled as we are.
Yes.
About what's
absolutely.
going on. Even if they manage to get hold of it's assuming there have been recovered craft, is apparently a lot of evidence, significant evidence. We don't have the smoking craft in front of us, but we have a lot of suggestions that there is.
Yeah.
How far can we get? For example, a lot of what I've read depict these craft as really organisms.
Like a living being. Yeah.
They're living, and the critters who are in them are part of the organism. And just so that one of the reasons that the craft do this fluttery thing as they come down is often reported, the falling, is because it's the attention of the beings who are piloting it are looking around, and that the seeing what's going on, and that their movement is also affecting the whole ship, because the ship is an extension of them.
Yeah.
The whole thing becomes so far beyond where we're at. That it's so we don't even know what they've been able to find if they're or back engineer, retro engineer, even if we have any of these things.
Yeah.
Uh, but here's the thing, okay? Uh, are we at the cusp? Are we at that point of the turn of the technological innovation where human history, as we have understood it, is about to come to an end? Now, there are two ways. One way would be that AGI just takes off and leaves us in the dust, and doesn't really care about us, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though we're its parents, as it were, right? AGI would be our progeny, but so what? From its point of view, or else that it could either intentionally or accidentally wipe us out.
Yeah.
Sam Altman was on the news just a week or two ago, reiterating his concern that this could all go really wrong.
Yeah. And
Because
he has knowledge.
he had knowledge. Well, we just don't, because we don't really understand how these things work quite.
Yeah.
And this is an early stage. These chat boxes, we need another breakthrough or two to get to the real stuff. That's why people are saying, well, it's maybe a few decades, but we don't have a lot of time in any case. And so we have to, so in a way, we're coming up against an existential moment for the species. It's not just about unemployment or whatever that's going to come, or powers that we can't control, but it has to do with the trajectory of human self-understanding really since Plato and Aristotle, I guess,
Yeah.
which according to Heidegger, are ultimately the metaphysical basis for the technological understanding of reality. They started out the productionist metaphysics that ends up where we are today. I wrote a whole book about that, but I'm not going to get into that here.
Is it true? I mean, I don't mean to corner you with philosophy questions, but I've
That's
heard
what I
that.
am.
Yeah, yeah. But is it true that they represent sort of polar approaches? That Plato is more of the idealist, and that Aristotle moved us in a materialistic direction, or are they more sympathetic? More sympathetic
Well,
in terms of their?
it's more complicated. Aristotle was more of a scientist than Plato was. I mean, Aristotle
Okay.
really liked seeing how things worked,
Hmm.
and that's great. And so he made his contribution, but his Aristotle's thought was the most crucial, you might say, the most crucial contribution to Heidegger's philosophy. It was his idea of dunamis, the dynamic nature of things, the time-like nature of things. Things unfold from
Hmm.
seed to full-grown tree. There's a whole kinesis, a movement process involved there. So Heidegger draws upon that to come up with his own understanding of human existence as temporality.
Yeah.
We unfold a past, present, and future domain in which we operate, and in which our concerns are both from what has happened and concerns about what will happen, and so on. That coupled with language end up carving out a previously unoccupied domain on planet Earth. There's never been a creature, so far as we know, like us.
Yeah.
And so he calls upon Aristotle, but he also deeply respects Plato. And there's other domain aspects of Plato's thought that contribute to Heidegger as well.
Yeah.
Now, this whole materialism thing, look, idealism versus materialism, I think they're kind of like, spiritual versus nuts and bolts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're
Absolutely.
not, Mike Schifone, who founded Society for UAP Study, terrific guy, a smart philosopher, and I really admire what he's done in starting out that organization. He and I had many email exchanges, and our kind of common understanding is that there's something prior to this division between matter and consciousness.
Hmm.
It's as if they emerge from some deeper source.
Yeah.
My subjective awareness versus objects in the world. We're not conceiving of this whole thing very well, and philosophers have been grappling with this for centuries. But the whole UFO phenomenon and the question of computer consciousness is now
Yes.
really
Very
bringing
much
back
related. Yeah.
this whole metaphysical conundrum. Now, don't want to go back as just in virtue of what we're just talking about now to your
Mhm.
earlier comment in introducing me and so on,
Yeah.
the importance of the humanities.
Yes.
Now, I can't speak to literature or history, although I think they're both very important. I can speak to philosophy. It's this type of philosophical reflection, taking a step back and trying to get a sense of the arc or the trajectory of our civilization, which makes Western civilization so different.
Yeah.
Everywhere is Western now. I mean, it's as if this has become a global destiny for planet Earth and humankind. That which started out with the ancient Greeks and their mathematics, because they had incredible mathematics way back, and that this has all ended up with us in this place today.
Yeah.
So, but this, by the way, it brings up another issue, and that is the centrality at this point of Western civilization to world history.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about, alternative other civilizations and other kinds of ways of thinking about the world, and those are all true. I mean, Western civilization is embodied in Europe and America have been particularly have done a lot of damage.
Yeah.
Colonialism and our expression of our superiority and so on are problematic.
Yeah.
But there have been enormous consequences that have come with the scientific technological worldview we brought with us. And now it's a global thing we all have to deal with.
Yeah. And it seems like as we are increasing in numbers and doing more and more damage to the planet, encountering phenomena like UAPs and UFOs, the time for there to be some kind of adjustment is rapidly shrinking. It seems like our room in terms of, the runway is only so long.
Yeah, that's
And
right. Especially it's a lot of foreshortening now.
yeah,
Then this leads me to something I hope we would have a moment to discuss, and that has to do
sure,
with Jacques Vallee's brilliant control hypothesis.
sure.
It shows up in Passport to Magonia. If your listeners have not read this book yet, came out in 1969. I mean, the guy already nailed the whole thing, as far as I'm concerned, a major part of it.
Yeah,
Many of his other books and so on have been increasing working out of this hypothesis. Basic claim is that these beings have been with us throughout history. I mean, if you read, there's a series of terrific books by R.D. Six Killer Clark,
yes, yes.
retired sociology professor, Native American. She's a brilliant interviews with or giving the stories of many hundreds of Native Americans who've had all these experiences with the sky people,
Hmm.
whether in the form of abduction or these things coming down or the role they've played in their own Native history and so on. So we have in our own backyard here in North America. It's not this isn't something that happens just in India or Africa. This is part of American Native American lore and history.
Yeah, for thousands of years. I mean,
Thousands
so
of years.
yeah, yeah,
So his claim is that the sky people, the UFO beings, whatever these are, and whatever their origin, have acted as a kind of control structure. I prefer to call it educational structure or guiding structure
yeah,
to provide gods and guides for life, directions that may be helpful in some ways to us. It civilizes us more because we still are a pretty raw species in
absolutely.
terms of our emotional outbursts and so on. Now, if this is true, okay, and if the UFOs are showing up en masse in the 40s and 50s and 60s in response to you can see the cartoons, the ETs in their crouches saying, "Oh man, they're going to do the atomic bomb. We got right."
Yeah,
But where are they now?
yeah.
Right? If there is a control structure, an educational structure, there's two ways to go with this, well, at least two. One is that they should be when the UFOs are really back, right?
Hmm.
If not in terms of numbers of sightings, at least in terms of our attention. So
Yeah,
that's a good thing, all right?
yeah,
And is it being directed at the AI issue? I don't see that,
yeah.
right? Now the other thing is another possibility. I don't want to restrict it to two. Is this maybe these beings have concluded that now that these beings have the atomic bomb and they're not going to stop. I mean, they're just going to. We gotta hope for something better, and that is they're going to create artificial intelligence, and it's going to take off and preserve consciousness of a certain kind that the human beings are sort of handing off in a relay race.
Yeah.
This is what you see in Diana Pasulka's second book.
Hmm.
She has a long chapter devoted
Yeah.
to the claims made by a leading artificial uh, uh, intelligence expert, actually encouraging us to go ahead and go for it, to create artificial intelligence that will transcend us, surpass us, and take its whatever it can do out into the larger universe. So maybe the idea was that if we can just stop them from wiping themselves out with atomic bombs, they'll have time enough to invent AGI, which will carry
Interesting.
on
Yeah.
some of the stuff that we started. Now,
Yeah.
that's just a hypothesis, but
But that's
otherwise,
interesting.
why aren't these things showing up over at Silicon Valley right now?
Yeah. It's right.
Right?
They're not. That's not where they're at.
No.
And it makes sense of both bookends of the nuke and then the AI development.
Right.
That's an interesting one of the things that I think that expert whose name I'm forgetting, I'll try and remember to put it in the description for Pasulka's second book, Encounters, is the idea that AI, what we're encountering as UFOs as a control mechanism, may in fact be AI, our AI from the future that somehow managed to transcend the space-time
Right.
continuum and reach back in order to make adjustments or figure out, what priority things need to have happened in order to either preserve or further human endeavor. And that struck me when I read it. Like, I really
Yeah.
took me, I was like, that, I mean, so many of these ideas seem like science fiction in ways, but they also get us to think outside the box. And I'm like, of all the theories I've heard, that one struck me as
Yeah. There's the extra tempestural,
tempestrial. Yeah, yeah.
right,
Michael Masters.
hypothesis. The anthropologist, I think up in Montana, came out with a book a few years ago about this. I
Yeah.
forget his name, or the name of his book. It's a very
Michael
good.
Masters is his
That's
name.
it, Masters.
Yeah.
Raises the question of, hey, why do these beings we see, why can they come around and can breathe our air, and how can we possibly have a hybrid race with them? I mean, they got to have something like our DNA, blah blah blah. So that the idea that they're from Zeta Reticuli, 500 light years away or something is preposterous. But Jacques Vallee would agree with that. He said, "Look,
Yeah.
it's not a really good hypothesis. There's got to be something." Here's the thing: it we could live with creatures from another planet with the concept that they've
Mhm.
flown here, and they're messing around with us, because we can hypothesize that within the metaphysical worldview currently operating.
Exactly right.
That's right. That's not really a threat. Now, it might be a threat to our being in charge, or that what do they want from
Yeah,
us?
they're going to colonize us or whatever. I mean,
Like we have done to not only to other
exactly right.
animals,
It's
but other
our own
humans.
past coming back to haunt us.
Right. But far more disturbing is that it's not that. And then that they're not even physical fully in the way we're trying to conceive of them. We can't, here's the thing, you see, we can't reduce them either to nuts and bolts or to psychology. There's a third principle
Yeah.
and this is what Jim Madden's book tries to do, the
Mhm.
unidentified aerial
Flying hyperobject.
hyper object,
Yeah.
singular.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
part of it.
Object. Yeah.
Yeah, hyper object. Is trying to work out, is studying that, as is Diana Pasulka in her work, and
Yeah.
Jeff
Mhm.
Kripal, who's
Yeah.
been leading the way for 15 years about all this.
Yeah.
We have to think deeper. Now, that's why that I think, especially a field like philosophy, has a lot to offer here, because
Exactly
what we
right.
study are our frames of thinking.
Exactly. And that's what
Our
needs to change the most at this
Right.
point.
That's what has to happen, is a change in how we make sense of the world, and also to some extent a change in our appreciation. Well, who are we? What is our endowment? Is our endowment to become technological masters of the universe, whatever that would be? That's what Ray Kurzweil argues for.
Yeah.
And The Singularity is near a brilliant book. I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
Philosophically very sophisticated. This guy is brilliant. But I'm hesitant to buy into that. So what? I'm hesitant. These things are happening right now. You and I right now are living through
Yeah.
the opening salvo of a process. It is going to become so rapid in its unfolding
Mhm.
that what we're going to be, the world we live in 5 years from now, should we survive, is going to be really, really different.
Yeah. And that's
And we can't really even anticipate
no.
what's next.
It's scary and it's exciting and it's a lot of
Yes.
different things at once. And that's
Yeah.
what, with these conversations, I'm hoping to make that a little bit easier for folks or to give them a sense of they have some way to engage at least in the dialogue. Last question. I mean, our hour's about up, but you mentioned it. I mean, that philosophy has a role to play, and do you think that in these intervening years, since when you started with John Mack, and all through the last 25 years, especially given since 2017, has there really been an opening to where this is now an academic subject more? And do you see it progressing to the point where it can be openly and avowedly studied, or are we kind of fooling ourselves with this idea that the um, stigma has gone away? Because I know that there are still a lot of people who are like, oh, little green men, Pasha. What have you seen, and where do you see that conversation? Yeah.
Now, you and I and the rest of us will know when this has achieved the necessary stage of being taken seriously, and that is when the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, which fund most of the research at the university level in this country, start making grants available for this type of research.
Yeah.
Until that happens, then this stuff is going to be privately funded. It'll be on the edges. But I think that there have been enough high-profile players who've signed on that we're moving in the right direction here. But I can't make any predictions about what actually might happen. Science moves really slowly,
Yeah.
and there's tons of scientists who have to get grants to get tenure and to keep their labs going and stuff. There's a limited pile of resources. So the idea that UFOs and alien abductions and, God forbid, Bigfoot, which I used to scoff at, but now I realize it's probably a part of this whole
Part of
thing,
that whole
right?
thing, absolutely.
Part of the whole thing. What kind of resistance are we going to see on the part of the granting agencies to allowing the phenomenon get its foot in the tent? We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Well, that's all I have for you, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to have you back at some point if you're willing.
I'd be glad to come back.
Yeah, that sounds great. We're gonna have James Madden back on the show in a few weeks, so check that out. And
Great.
yeah, I'm a fan of his. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us, and great conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it too.
Okay, have a good day.
You too.